Dusty Rhodes, the owner and sole proprietor of the last roundup, kept reading the funny papers, his lips moving ever so slightly as I sat contemplating my empty glass. It was late afternoon, and a few anemic shafts of sunlight still straggled in through the front window past the unlit neon sign, only to die, unmourned and unloved, on its stained patch of linoleum just short of the bar. On the other side of the window was Hollywood. Not the Hollywood you're probably thinking of, the glittering city of MGM and Grauman's Chinese and the Brown Derby, but its decidedly less glamorous flip side. An ugly little town of third-run movie houses and cheap lunch counters and run-down dives like this one. And it didn't get much better any further out. Out there was the war in Korea and the House Un-American Activity and all the other attendant horrors of this year of our Lord, and he could have it, 1950. But in the last roundup, it was the Hollywood you're thinking of, or at least one of its shabbier outlying precincts. In there, it wasn't 1950, it was the Old West, as portrayed by Republic Pictures. As the name suggested, the last roundup had been decorated, if you could call it that, in a Western motif. Cowboy paraphernalia, some of its souvenirs of Dusty's movie career, bereft scavenged from prop house trash cans and dismantled movie sets, haphazardly cluttered the walls, along with a handful of fading posters for Poverty Row horse offers you probably never saw. The overall effect was pretty corny and even a little sad. Certainly no one I know would have been caught dead in the place, which is why I was there. Yeah, then what? Dusty was looking at me, and I realized that I'd been speaking out loud, not just hearing the words in my head, so I pushed my glass towards him and continued. You ever notice how many jokes start with the words, "So this guy walks into a bar"? Deciding I was a less promising source of diversion than Joe Palooka, Dusty turned his attention back to the comics. That's so, comrade, because I reckon your life must be a regular laugh riot. Seriously, I said, ignoring the dig and directing what I hoped was an especially pointed look at my still empty glass. They say there are only two types of stories. One's where a guy leaves town, and one's where a guy comes into town. That a fact. Dusty didn't look up, but with an ease born of long years of practice, snagged a bottle of old overhauled rye from the shelf behind him and swung it around in a graceful arc, bringing it to hover directly over my glass, all without taking his eyes off the newspaper. You know, he said, pointing at the page with his free hand, maybe that's Dick Tracy's problem here. He doesn't go anywhere. He got all settled down like. In fact, ever since him and Tess Trueheart got married, I think he kind of lost his edge. It happens, I said. Well, so I'm told. He gave me a look that could mean just about anything before making up his mind to pour. That reminds me, I haven't seen that girl of yours lately. You and her still together? I met my girlfriend Rita, a topic I didn't particularly feel like discussing. She's working over at Paramount this week. Dusty had the good grace not to pursue the matter any further, and instead flicked a speck of dust from the jar of pickled eggs by the cash register. Knowing I had to make this one last, I didn't touch my drink right away. Anyway, so this guy walks into a bar. Could be either type of story. The guy in question could be a stranger coming into a familiar location, or someone going to an unfamiliar one in search of adventure, depending on whose point of view you're telling the story from, his or the people in the bar. Well, there you go. Maybe you ought to write for the movies. Damn shame a guy like you wasting his talents in a two-bit joint like this. Very funny. I knew he was joking, but it stung anyway. Thousands of comedians out of work, and you're holding down two jobs. That's two more than you got, unless you think going through other people's dirty laundry is a real job. Three more, I said, if you think bragging to impressionable women about how you used to double for Dustin Farnham is another one of yours. He put the paper aside and poured a shot of bourbon for himself. He clinked his glass against my as-yet untouched drink, which immediately ceased to remain untouched, and tossed it back in one swallow. Dusty grew up in a ranch in Montana. Blessed with good looks, an amiable disposition, and excellent horsemanship skills, he eventually made his way out to Hollywood, where he'd hoped to become the next Tom Mix. Unfortunately for him, good looks turned out to be less of a novelty here than they were in Missoula, and an amiable disposition turned out to be a positive drawback in the dog-eat-dog world of motion pictures. Fortunately, his horsemanship skills brought him reasonably steady work as a stuntman, at least until age and injury caught up with him. By then, he'd managed to put away enough money to open the last roundup, which, be it ever so humble, still put him ahead of a lot of other poor bastards who'd seen their Hollywood dreams crash and burn, like me, for instance. I was spared any further introspection by a voice from the end of the bar. I'd been dimly aware of the amorphous shape keeping Dusty and me company as we waited for the after-work crowd to start drifting in, but I hadn't paid it much attention until now. And when I peered into the late afternoon gloom, it resolved itself into a decidedly inebriated couple, the female half of which was now addressing me. Hey! She leaned forward and pointed at me, sloshing most of her stinger onto the bar. You didn't want to ever tell you look like Dick Powell? Not lately, I said. One leaned in further and squinted at me. Only you're taller, and thinner, and darker, and you don't have curly hair, and your ears are Before she could add that I also differed from Dick Powell and that he was working and that I wasn't, her companion broke in. Dick Powell doesn't have curly hair. You sure? The woman turned back and, who am I thinking of then? After a moment's deliberation, the man, who was even drunker than she was, if that were possible, said, William Powell? Yeah, that's it, William Powell. No, wait, not him. He has a mustache. I meant that other guy, the one in that movie with the kid. The man squinted at me and then snorted. Oh, I don't look like him either. But by then, the woman had moved on to another topic. So was you ever in pictures then? You're on your own there, comrade, said Dusty, who had suddenly developed a fierce interest in the light refracting properties of the glass he'd already polished to within an inch of its life. I finished my drink before answering. Yeah, once. I was a writer. I didn't add that this was before my politics became too inconvenient for my studio's higher-ups, which is why Dusty jokingly insisted on addressing me as comrade. But why dredge up the long-dead past? This was Hollywood, after all, where unhappy endings are box office poison. Well, ain't that a coinky-dink? I used to be in the movies myself. I'm Mabel Butler. Maybe you'd heard of me. I hadn't, but why ruin it for? Really, I said. If I'd stepped out the front door, which admittedly wasn't likely as long as Dusty was letting me run a tab, I could have thrown a brick in any direction and hit someone just like her. Someone hanging on to the fading memories of the showbiz career that had long since died, or, more likely, had never materialized in the first place. Another walking corpse that didn't know enough to get itself buried. And I'd have been doing them a favor, too. Or at least I've been putting them out of their misery, although I still need to find someone to put me out of mine. You ever see Belle of the Yukon? Mabel Butler was still talking. I was in that one, too. I was one of the saloon girls. You were great, too, honey, said her friend. He then began groping unsteadily in the general vicinity of her décolletage. Before he could get a definite fix on its location, she batted its hand away and continued speaking. They say I could have been another Gene Tierney if I'd gotten the right breaks. Yeah, right. And my grandmother could have played shortstop for the Brooklyn Dodgers if it weren't for her rheumatism. I took a closer look at her. She was younger than I thought at first, possibly not even 30, which would have made her a good 5 years younger than I was. A sobering thought if I wanted to be sober. And while she might have been pretty once, too many years of hard living had long since taken their toll. Hair dyed a biologically improbable shade of blonde, and makeup applied with too free and unsteady a hand didn't help either. It's all that bastard Joe Gittelson's fault. If he hadn't, I'd been drifting off again, but the mention of Joe Gittleson brought me back to earth with an almost audible thud. Who did you say? I said, thinking I'd misheard. Joe Gittleson, you know me? Had me under personal contract, he called it. Personal contract my ass. Personal whores, more like it. Never even put me in one lousy picture. If I'd known then what I know now. She made a sound halfway between a loud sob and a cat coughing up a hairball, which caused her gentleman friend, who'd since fallen asleep, to stir momentarily and emit a light snore. It had been a long time since I heard that name, but scarcely a day went by when I didn't curse its owner. Joe Gittleson, J.P. Gittleson, if you're the type who reads movie credits, was the assistant head of production at my old studio. It was he who called me into his office one day 2 years ago, and in a voice brimming with phony regret, told me that not only was I being pulled from my current assignment, but that the studio wouldn't be renewing my contract.